love this old diagram, this old woodcut. If you take a look at it, you'll see that, I'll try to speak loudly because I'm away from the mic now. But the Earth was viewed as being flat, and it was surrounded by the firmament, which was literally a metal dome that surrounded the flat Earth. And then above the firmament was the waters above the firmament, and the rain, and of course the waters of the 40 days of Noah's flood, the 40 days of rainfall, came through the windows and the doors and windows of heaven, which were basically holes in the firmament. And then, of course, heaven was above the waters, above the firmament, and then God was above that. And then you have bad stuff down here, but Earth was the sort of okay. Now, when the ancient Hebrews viewed the world as flat, it was flat like a coin is flat. It was flat like a nickel. It was round, okay, but flat. The Bible talks about the circle of the earth. It doesn't talk about the sphere of the earth, okay, because a circle is a two-dimensional structure, and that was the view of the shape of the world. And things like the variety of languages that human beings express around the planet. This was explained by largely through revelation, the Tower of Babel. The confusion of languages during the building of the Tower of Babel was a supernatural explanation for what we would consider today a natural phenomenon, the evolution of language, shall we say, the descent with modification, if you will, of language. And basically what Darwin did was to contribute substantially to a change from the view of the world as static versus changing, and also change the view from supernatural explanations to natural explanations. But Darwin didn't do this all by himself. He built, stood on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. He built upon a foundation that went back very far. Let me talk a little bit about special creationism, because that is the idea that contrasts most strongly with evolution as we understand it today. Now, special creationism is a term of art and theology. It's a particular kind of creationism. It's not just that God created, because God can create in lots and lots of ways, but special creationism is a statement about how God created. And it's pretty much what we see in biblical literalism. The most important aspect of special creationism is that God creates things in their present form. So barnacles are a separate kind, and pine trees are a kind, and human beings are a kind, and primates are a kind, and rabbits are a kind. You have kinds of organisms, plants and animals, that are created separately, independently. And you can, of course, have variation within the kind. You can have a cat kind that includes tigers and pumas and house cats and so forth, but the cat kind and the dog kind don't share a common ancestor. So the special creation has to do with the creation of organisms pretty much as we see them today, as separately creatures in their present form and as separately created kinds with limited genetic variation. Now, usually special creation theologies argue for creation at one time. The young earth creationism, with which you are probably familiar, is the idea that God created everything in those 6 24-hour days as discussed in Genesis. There also is old earth special creationism, in which through various ways of reinterpreting Genesis, either as the days are very long periods of time, or there is a big gap between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, that an old age of the earth is worked in. But when it comes to biology, even old age creationists are special creationists, in that they believe God created things in their present form, there wasn't change through time, and that God created things separately, that there wasn't any kind of descent with modification going on. By about 1500 to 1700, the idea that the world was not flat was pretty well established. That idea of the old Hebrew cosmology had pretty much gone by the wayside. And similarly, the idea of geocentrism, of the planets going, and the sun and everything going around the earth, was also rejected. I neglected to point out when I showed you that ancient Hebrew slide that the sun and the moon and the stars were under the firmament, which makes it a geocentric world. I forgot to point that out. probably because I was so upset because it took so long to get into the thing. The little picture on the side there is a Tycho Brahe's version of heliocentrism, by the way. The little yellow dot in the middle, that's the sun. The little blue dot is the Earth. And so indeed, the planets, by and large, this is really cool. The planets go around the sun, but the sun goes around the Earth. Okay, so it is a geocentric point. So there are lots of different kinds of geocentric points of view. But by and large, those views had been given up by about the 1500s to the 1700s. But something else happened during the 1500s, 1600s that was to profoundly shake up some of these static ideas, particularly the idea of stasis. And this was the voyages of discovery from Europe to other parts of the world. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, remember that? Okay, that's the period we're talking about here. When Europeans went out and discovered there was a whole literally new world of North and South America, this had very profound consequences for how they looked at nature and also how they looked at the Bible. Because there were all sorts of stuff in these new worlds that weren't mentioned in the Bible at all. There's nothing in the Bible about Nebraska. Okay, there's nothing in the Bible. The Bible talks about Africa, it talks about Asia. It doesn't talk about Panama. It doesn't talk about North and South America. There's animals that were discovered in North and South America and in Australia, Polynesia, parts of the world that were up until that time unknown to Europeans. There were animals and plants found that were very, very different from anything that scientists or anybody else was familiar with, and they weren't mentioned in the Bible. But even more significantly for religion, there were people over there. And were these the sons of Adam? And this was a very important theological issue. In fact, one of the more progressive things that the Catholic Church did during the period of colonialization was to declare that actually American Indians are human. So they can't be enslaved. They have souls, and we can try to save their souls. Actually, that was a little better than some of the other colonial views, but nonetheless. You can see how that would be a real interesting issue. If they were the sons of Adam, were they also redeemed by Jesus' sacrifice? So there's all these theological issues that had to be considered. There were fossils eventually that were discovered in the New World, and how do those fit with the fossils in the Old World? So the voyages of exploration were another kind of chink in this old way of looking at the world as being this specially created, unchanging, static environment that had remained the same for all 10,000 years, all 6,000 years that the Earth had existed. Dave mentioned Newton, who is certainly, I easily agree with you, he's one of the top three. An amazing scientist. Well, Newton was a very religious man. In fact, if you look at the whole series of things that he wrote and things that he did, he spent as much time on kind of supernaturalist stuff, more time actually, than he did on his actual science. Imagine what would have happened if he had devoted his full time to it. But he really made some astonishing discoveries about nature, clearly. Now, Newton, as I say, was a very devout Christian. And his view was that if he could find the rules, the laws by which God operates the universe, then that would make God even more awesome and even more worthy of worship than a God who is sort of tinkering, constantly intervening and making the world work. If Newton felt that if he could demonstrate mathematically that the planets went around the sun of their own accord rather than the angels out there guiding them, then God was much, much more impressive. So he basically dedicated his life to the glory of God, to finding the way God made the universe work. Now, think about that. That's a very interesting idea from a theological standpoint and very radical. Because if your theological view, which I would say arguably up until about that time period, was that God is constantly intervening to make the world work. All of a sudden, God works through secondary cause. God works through his created laws, but that moves God back a step. And that's a very different relationship that people would have to God then, because God is a little bit more distant.